there is a photograph that most people have never seen. It was taken on a Sunday afternoon in January of 1987 inside a stadium so loud that the concrete beneath the stands was trembling. The temperature hovered near freezing. 98 yards of frozen grass separated a young quarterback from the impossible. His team trailed by 7 points with 5 minutes and 32 seconds remaining in the American Football Conference Championship game, the winner of which would advance to the Super Bowl. The camera caught him at the exact moment he stepped into the huddle. His helmet was scuffed. His jersey was grass-stained and torn along one shoulder. His breath left his mouth in a thick white cloud. But his eyes were utterly calm. Not confident in the way athletes perform confidence for the cameras. Calm in the way a man is calm when he has already decided what he is going to do and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. That quarterback was John Elway. He was 26 years old, and the drive he was about to lead would become one of the most famous sequences in the history of professional football, a 98-yard march through hostile territory. 15 plays across a field that felt like it was tilting against him. It would be remembered simply as the drive. Capital T, capital D. 2 words that need no further explanation, anywhere football is spoken and loved. But this story is not really about that single drive. Or at least, it is not only about that drive, because John Elway's life in football spans so much more than one frozen afternoon in Cleveland. It spans 16 seasons in the National Football League, all of them spent wearing the orange and blue of the Denver Broncos. It spans a childhood spent on practice fields across the American West, learning the game from a father who coached it for a living. It spans a college career at Stanford University that made him the most coveted quarterback prospect of his generation. It spans a draft day controversy that scandalized the sports world and made him a villain before he had ever played a single professional snap. And it spans the long, painful middle years. The 3 devastating Super Bowl losses that threatened to stamp his career with the label of noble failure. The whispered accusations that he could not win the big one. The Sunday afternoons when he carried an entire franchise on his shoulders because there was nobody else capable of bearing the weight. The quiet desperation of a man who knows he is running out of time. This is a story about winning, but it is also a story about losing badly, publicly, repeatedly, about what it does to a man when the entire country watches him fall short on the biggest stage 3 separate times, and each time the fall is harder than the last. Super Bowl 21, Super Bowl 22, Super Bowl 24, 3 games, 3 blowouts, a combined score of 136-40 in favor of the other team. Those numbers are brutal. They are the kind of numbers that end careers. The kind of numbers that follow a man to his grave, etched into the footnotes of his obituary as evidence that greatness was not quite great enough. But John Elway refused to accept that verdict. He kept playing. He kept competing. He kept dragging his team into the playoffs, year after year, waiting for the moment when everything would finally align. And when that moment came, when he was 37 years old, and most people had long since given up on him, he seized it with a ferocity that shook the entire football world. He did not just win 1 Super Bowl, he won 2, back-to-back. He won them with tears running down his face, and his body breaking down, and the ghost of every loss he had ever suffered standing in the shadows of the end zone, watching him finally cross the goal line. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what made John Elway different from every other quarterback who has ever played this game. Not just the arm strength, which was legendary, the kind of arm that made scouts stammer and coaches redesign their offenses. Not just the scrambling ability, which defied logic for a man who stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds. Not just the competitiveness, which bordered on something deeper and darker and more consuming than most people realized. You are going to understand the price he paid for greatness. The loneliness of carrying an entire city's hopes on your right arm for nearly 2 decades. The way losing 3 Super Bowls before the age of 30 can hollow a man out from the inside, creating a void that no regular season victory, no Pro Bowl selection, no statistical milestone can ever fill. And you are going to understand the quiet, almost unbearable beauty of finally winning when everyone, including yourself, had begun to believe it might never happen. This is a story about a father and a son, about the coach who put a football in a boy's hands and the boy who spent the rest of his life trying to honor that gift. It is a story about Denver, Colorado, and what it means when an entire city wraps its identity around one man's right arm. It is a story about time, about how the years pile up and the body breaks down and the window gets smaller and smaller until it feels like it is about to close forever. And it is a story about redemption, the kind that arrives so late that you have almost forgotten what it feels like to hope for it. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let us begin. To understand what John Elway meant to the game of football, you first have to understand the position he played. And to understand the position he played, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the earliest days of professional football, when the quarterback was not a star. He was barely even a player in the way we think of players today. He was a functionary, a traffic cop, a man whose job was to take the ball from the center and give it to someone more important. In the 1890s, when American football was still evolving from its rugby roots, there was no forward pass. The game was played entirely on the ground. Teams lined up in mass formations, wedge-shaped clusters of humanity that smashed into each other with a violence that was genuinely dangerous. Players died on the field. Serious injuries were common and expected. The quarterback's role in this era was almost administrative. He received the ball and he distributed it. That was the extent of his contribution. The glory belonged to the men who ran with the ball, the halfbacks and fullbacks who lowered their shoulders and fought for every yard through a wall of bodies. The forward pass was legalized in 1906, largely as a safety measure. President Theodore Roosevelt himself had pressured the football establishment to reform the game after a series of deaths and catastrophic injuries on college fields. The new rules opened up the field, creating space that had not existed before. But the pass was slow to catch on. The balls were fat and difficult to spiral. The rules penalized incomplete passes harshly, sometimes resulting in a turnover if the ball hit the ground. Most coaches viewed throwing as an act of desperation, something you did when the ground game had failed and you had no other option. Real football, the thinking went, was played between the tackles. Real football was about toughness and discipline, and the willingness to impose your physical will on the opponent. Throwing the ball was soft, it was undignified. It was, in the minds of many football men, something close to cheating. This attitude persisted for decades. Through the 1910s and 1920s, even as the forward pass became more common, the quarterback remained a secondary figure. He called the plays, yes, he read the defense sometimes, but the stars were the runners. Red Grange, the galloping ghost of the University of Illinois, became one of the first great professional football celebrities in the 1920s, and he did it entirely with his legs. When the National Football League was founded in 1920 in Canton, Ohio, the game it governed was still fundamentally a running game. Quarterbacks were chosen for their intelligence and their toughness, not their throwing ability. They were expected to manage the game, not dominate it. The first meaningful shift in the quarterback's role came in the 1930s and 1940s. Sammy Baugh, a tall Texan who played for the Washington franchise, began to show what a gifted passer could do. Baugh joined the league in 1937 and immediately changed the way teams thought about the passing game. He led the league in passing yards multiple times and led his team to championships. His accuracy and his willingness to throw the ball in all situations, not just as a last resort, made defenses adjust in ways they never had before. Baugh proved that the forward pass was not a gimmick. It was a weapon, and in the right hands, it could be the most dangerous weapon on the field. Around the same time, Sid Luckman of the Chicago Bears was revolutionizing the position from a different angle. Playing under the legendary George Halas, Luckman operated the T formation offense, which placed the quarterback directly behind the center rather than several yards deep in the older single-wing formation. This adjustment seems small in retrospect, but it was transformative. It gave the quarterback better vision of the field. It made handoffs and play-action fakes smoother and more deceptive. And it positioned the quarterback as the central figure in the offense, the man through whom every play flowed. Luckman threw 7 touchdown passes in a single game in 1943, a record that stood for decades. The T formation became the standard offensive alignment, and the quarterback's importance grew accordingly. The 1950s brought a new generation of passers who built on what Bow and Luckman had established. Otto Graham of the Cleveland Browns was perhaps the most successful quarterback of this era, leading his team to 10 consecutive championship games between 1946 and 1955, and winning 7 of them. Graham was disciplined, accurate, and efficient, a model of consistency in an era when consistency was rare. Bobby Lane of the Detroit Lions was a different kind of quarterback, a hard-living Texan whose toughness and competitiveness made him one of the most feared players in the league. Norm Van Brocklin of the Los Angeles Rams was a pure passer whose arm strength and accuracy foreshadowed the modern era of the position. But the quarterback was still, in fundamental ways, a dependent figure. The coach called the plays, the quarterback executed them. The relationship between coach and quarterback was hierarchical, with the coach firmly in command. Quarterbacks were expected to follow orders, not to think independently. They were expected to manage the game, not to carry it. The idea of a quarterback as the dominant force on a football team, the way a great hitter dominates a baseball team or a great scorer dominates a basketball team, had not yet taken hold. Then came Johnny Unitas, and everything changed. Unitas arrived in Baltimore in 1950, a crew-cut kid from Pittsburgh who had been cut by his hometown Steelers and was playing semi-professional football for $6 a game when the Colts gave him a chance. What he did with that chance is one of the great origin stories in American sports. Unitas did not just throw the football well. He commanded the field with an authority that no previous quarterback had possessed. He read defenses before the snap and changed his play calls at the line of scrimmage, a practice known as audibling that was revolutionary for its time. He stood in the pocket with defenders closing in on him, absorbing punishing hits, and delivered the ball at the last possible instant with a calm that bordered on recklessness. He was tough in a way that transcended physical toughness. He was mentally unbreakable. The 1958 NFL championship game between Unitas's Colts and the New York Giants is often called the greatest game ever played. It went to sudden death overtime, the first championship game in league history to require extra time, and Unitas engineered a methodical, clinical drive that ended with a 1-yard touchdown run by fullback Alan Ameche to win the title. That game was broadcast on national television to an audience of approximately 45 million people. It introduced professional football to the American mainstream in a way that no previous game had, and it established the quarterback as the central figure of the sport, the man the camera followed, the man whose name the fans chanted, the man around whom the entire spectacle revolved. After Unitas, the quarterback position entered a new era. Joe Namath brought celebrity and swagger to the position, guaranteeing a victory in Super Bowl III in January of 1969, and then delivering on that guarantee, an act of audacity that transformed both the Super Bowl and the public perception of the quarterback. Namath showed that a quarterback could be more than an athlete. He could be a cultural figure, a personality, a brand. Roger Staubach of the Dallas Cowboys brought a different dimension to the position. Staubach was a former Navy officer who combined military discipline with genuine athletic ability. He could throw from the pocket with precision, but he could also scramble when the play broke down, extending plays with his legs in a way that few quarterbacks of his era could match. He won 2 Super Bowls and established the idea that mobility was not a liability for a quarterback, but an asset. Terry Bradshaw of the Pittsburgh Steelers brought raw arm strength and an unpolished toughness that helped anchor the most dominant dynasty of the 1970s. Bradshaw won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years, a feat that has only been matched by a handful of quarterbacks in history. He was not elegant, he was not cerebral, but he had an arm that could throw the ball 70 yards and a competitive fire that burned so hot it sometimes consumed his own teammates. Bradshaw proved that physical talent, when combined with the right supporting cast and the right coaching, could win championships consistently. Fran Tarkenton of the Minnesota Vikings brought yet another dimension. Tarkenton was the original scrambling quarterback, a small, quick, elusive player who drove defenses and coaches crazy with his refusal to stay in the pocket. He would drop back, find no open receiver, and then take off running, weaving through defenders and either gaining yards on the ground or buying time to find a receiver downfield. Tarkenton's style was exciting but controversial. Many coaches believed that a quarterback who scrambled was a quarterback who had failed to execute the play as designed. But Tarkenton's success, he made 3 Super Bowls and held numerous passing records when he retired, was undeniable. Each of these quarterbacks expanded the boundaries of the position in some way. Unitas established the quarterback as the central figure. Namath proved the quarterback could be a star. Staubach showed that mobility mattered. Bradshaw demonstrated the power of a great arm. Tarkenton proved that improvisation could be a viable strategy. But none of them combined all of these qualities into a single player. None of them possessed the arm strength and the mobility and the intelligence and the improvisational brilliance and the sheer, relentless competitiveness in one package. The position was evolving, but it was evolving in separate directions. The pocket passer and the scrambler were seen as different archetypes, different species almost, each with its own strengths and limitations. By the late 1970s, the quarterback position had diversified into distinct archetypes. There was the pocket passer, the man who stood tall behind his offensive line and delivered the ball with mechanical precision. There was the scrambler, the man who used his legs to extend plays and create opportunities. There was the game manager, the man who executed the coach's play calls efficiently and avoided mistakes. And there was the gunslinger, the man who trusted his arm above all else and threw the ball into windows that lesser quarterbacks would never attempt. Each archetype had its champions and its critics. Each had produced winners and losers, but no one had figured out how to combine them all into a single player. The league itself was changing in ways that would make the quarterback even more important. Rule changes in the late 1970s, particularly the enforcement of pass interference and the restrictions on how defensive backs could cover receivers, opened up the passing game considerably. Offenses began throwing more, completion percentages rose, passing yards per game increased. The NFL was becoming a passing league, slowly but unmistakably, and the quarterback was becoming the most valuable asset a franchise could possess. Teams that had great quarterbacks won. Teams that did not have great quarterbacks searched desperately for one. The quarterback market was becoming the driving force of the entire league's economy, dictating draft strategies, salary structures, and franchise valuations. Then came the 1980s, and the position reached a crossroads. Bill Walsh, the brilliant head coach of the San Francisco 49ers, developed the West Coast offense, a system that redefined the passing game. Walsh's philosophy was based on short, precise passes that functioned almost like an extension of the running game. Instead of throwing deep and hoping for big plays, Walsh's quarterback threw quick slants, screen passes, and checkdowns that moved the chains methodically and kept the defense off balance. The system required a quarterback who was accurate, quick-thinking, and patient. It did not require a cannon for an arm. It required precision. Joe Montana was the perfect vessel for Walsh's philosophy. Montana was calm under pressure, almost preternaturally so. He had a quick release, excellent accuracy, and a genius-level ability to read defenses. He did not make the spectacular play because the system was designed to make the spectacular unnecessary. Montana won 4 Super Bowls with the 49ers and was named Super Bowl Most Valuable Player 3 times. He was, for a significant period, considered the greatest quarterback who had ever played the game, and his success validated the West Coast offense as the dominant philosophy in professional football. Dan Marino of the Miami Dolphins represented the opposite extreme. Marino had perhaps the quickest release in NFL history and an arm that could throw the ball with astonishing velocity and accuracy. In 1984, his second season, he threw for 48 touchdowns and over 5,000 yards, numbers that were so far beyond anything the league had ever seen that they seemed almost fictional. Marino was a pure pocket passer, a quarterback who stood behind his offensive line and carved up defenses with his arm alone. He did not run. He did not need to. His arm was weapon enough. But Marino, for all his individual brilliance, never won a Super Bowl. He appeared in one after that historic 1984 season, and his Dolphins were beaten soundly by Montana's 49ers. He spent the remaining 15 years of his career putting up staggering statistics, but never returning to the championship game. Marino's career became a cautionary tale about the limits of individual talent. No matter how gifted the quarterback, he could not win a championship alone. He needed a supporting cast. He needed a defense. He needed a running game. He needed all the things that Montana had in San Francisco and that Marino never quite had in Miami. This was the landscape into which John Elway emerged. Montana on one side, the system quarterback, the surgical precision passer. Marino on the other, the pure arm talent, the stats machine. Two models of quarterback excellence, each with its own strengths and its own limitations. Elway was something different from either of them. He was the synthesis, the fusion of every quality the position had ever produced, rolled into a single player with a gap-toothed grin and a cannon attached to his right shoulder. Elway could throw the ball as hard as Marino, or close to it. His arm strength was the stuff of legend. Receivers talked about catching his passes as a form of punishment, the ball arriving with such velocity that it stung their hands through their gloves. But Elway could also throw with touch when the situation demanded it, floating a deep ball over a defender's outstretched hands with the kind of delicate precision that seemed impossible from a man with such raw power. He could read defenses with Montana's intelligence, going through his progressions quickly and finding the open man. And he could run, not like a running back exactly, but with a speed and athleticism that no quarterback of his size had ever shown before. When the pocket collapsed, Elway did not just stand there and take the sack, the way Marino often did. He escaped. He scrambled. He created. He turned broken plays into first downs and first downs into touchdowns through sheer physical ability, combined with an improvisational instinct that seemed almost supernatural. The 1983 NFL Draft, which brought Elway into the professional game, is widely regarded as the greatest quarterback draft class in the history of the league. 6 quarterbacks were taken in the first round. Elway went first overall to the Baltimore Colts. Todd Blackledge was selected 7th by the Kansas City Chiefs. Jim Kelly went 14th to the Buffalo Bills. Tony Eason was taken 15th by the New England Patriots. Ken O'Brien went 24th to the New York Jets. And Dan Marino, the man who would rewrite the record books, went 27th to the Miami Dolphins. 3 of those 6, Elway, Kelly and Marino, would be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It was the richest quarterback class in draft history, and Elway was its crown jewel. But Elway's entry into the professional ranks was anything but smooth. He refused to play for the Baltimore Colts, citing some concerns about the organization's direction and stability. He had leverage because he had also been drafted by the New York Yankees of Major League Baseball and had a genuine option to pursue a career in a different sport entirely. The standoff between Elway and the Colts became a national story, a drama that played out on the front pages of sports sections across America. He was called arrogant. He was called entitled. He was called a spoiled kid who thought he was bigger than the game. Eventually, the Colts traded him to the Denver Broncos in exchange for offensive lineman Chris Hinton, quarterback Mark Herman, and a first-round pick in the following year's draft. It was an enormous price. But Denver believed they were getting the most talented quarterback in football, and over the next 16 seasons, they would be proved right. The evolution of the quarterback position, from Sammy Baugh to Johnny Unitas to Joe Namath to Roger Staubach to Terry Bradshaw to Joe Montana to Dan Marino, was a journey of incremental progress. Each generation's great quarterbacks added something new to the position's toolkit. Baugh proved that passing could work. Unitas proved that a quarterback could command a game. Namath proved that a quarterback could be a star. Staubach proved that a quarterback could run. Bradshaw proved that arm strength wins titles. Montana proved that precision and system could be supreme. Marino proved that a single arm could produce numbers the world had never imagined. It is worth pausing here to consider just how narrow the quarterback's evolution had been before Elway arrived. For most of the sport's history, the position was defined by limitations as much as by strengths. If a quarterback had a strong arm, he was expected to stand in the pocket and throw deep. If he was mobile, he was expected to run but not necessarily throw with accuracy. If he was intelligent, he was expected to manage the game but not necessarily make the spectacular play. The great quarterbacks before Elway each excelled in one or two areas but accepted limitations in others. Montana did not have a powerful arm, but his accuracy and decision-making compensated. Marino had the greatest arm the league had seen, but his immobility made him vulnerable to pressure. Staubach could run, but his era did not encourage it as a primary strategy. Tarkenton could scramble, but his arm was only average. The position had produced specialists, not generalists. The scouting world reflected this limited thinking. When teams evaluated quarterback prospects in the decades before Elway, they had a checklist of attributes, but they expected trade-offs. You could get arm strength or accuracy, but probably not both at elite levels. You could get mobility or pocket presence, but rarely both. You could get a system quarterback who made smart decisions, or a gunslinger who made breathtaking throws, but the two were different species in the minds of most evaluators. The idea that a single quarterback could check every box on the scouting sheet, arm strength, accuracy, mobility, intelligence, leadership, toughness, and competitive fire, was considered unrealistic. That combination simply did not exist in the real world of professional football. Until it did. Until a young man walked out of Stanford University in the spring of 1983 and forced the entire football establishment to reconsider what was possible at the most important position in team sports. Elway's physical measurements alone were staggering. He stood 6 feet 3 inches and weighed 215 pounds. He could throw a football with a velocity that was clocked at over 60 miles per hour. He could run a 40-yard dash in under 4 7/10 seconds, a time that would have been respectable for a wide receiver. His hand size was enormous, allowing him to grip the ball securely even in rain and cold. His release was quick, his throwing motion was compact and efficient. He was, in the clinical language of the scouting report, the most physically gifted quarterback prospect in the history of the sport. But physical gifts alone do not make a great quarterback. What separated Elway from other physical specimens who had flamed out at the professional level was his football intelligence. He understood defenses. He could read a coverage before the snap and adjust his play accordingly. He went through his progressions quickly and decisively. He had the rare ability to process information at full speed, to make decisions in the chaos of a collapsing pocket that other quarterbacks could only make in the calm of a film room. His father, a football coach, had drilled this into him from childhood. The mechanics, the footwork, the reads, the progressions, all of it had been taught and reinforced over years of practice until it became instinct. John Elway took all of those qualities and merged them into one player. He was the culmination of everything the position had been building toward for 60 years. He was the prototype for the modern NFL quarterback, the player who could do everything, who could beat you with his arm or his legs, who could execute within a system or improvise outside of it, who could manage a game or take it over. Every great dual-threat quarterback who has played since, every young prospect who combines arm talent with athletic ability, carries a piece of John Elway's legacy in his game, whether he knows it or not. And the story of what he did with those gifts, the triumphs and the heartbreaks, and the long, painful road from promise to fulfillment, begins not on a football field in Denver, but on the wet, green fields of the Pacific Northwest, where a coach's son first learned to throw a spiral. It begins in gymnasiums and on practice fields, and in the passenger seat of a car driving from one small town to another, following a father whose life was football and whose greatest creation was not a playbook or a winning season, but a son who would carry the game farther than anyone who came before him. The quarterback position had been waiting nearly a century for a player like John Elway. The question was whether the game was ready for what he would do with it. John Albert Elway Jr. was born on June 28, 1960, in Port Angeles, Washington. Port Angeles is a small coastal town on the northern edge of the Olympic Peninsula, a place of thick forests, cold salt water, and a quietness that wraps itself around you like fog. It sits across the Strait of Juan de Fuca from Vancouver Island, closer to Canada than to any major American city. It is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, and the local high school football game is the biggest event of the week. It is not the kind of place that produces NFL legends. But geography is not destiny, and the forces that shaped John Elway had less to do with where he was born than with who raised him. His father, Jack Elway, was a football coach. This single fact is the key to understanding everything that followed. Jack was not a famous coach, not a man whose name appeared in national newspapers or on television broadcasts. He was a career football man, a teacher of the game, who worked at small colleges and high schools across the western United States, moving his family from town to town as opportunities arose. He coached at Port Angeles High School. He coached at Grays Harbor College. He coached at the College of the Sequoias in Visalia, California. He coached at Montana State University. He coached at Washington State University. He coached at Cal State Northridge. Each move brought a new town, a new school, a new set of players, and each move brought his son along. John Elway grew up on football fields, not metaphorically, literally. From the time he was old enough to walk, he was present at his father's practices, running around the sidelines, while players in helmets and pads crashed into each other a few yards away. He absorbed the game through osmosis, watching drills and formations and play calls the way other children watched cartoons. By the time he was 5 or 6, Jack had begun teaching him the fundamentals of throwing a football. Not casually, the way a father tosses a ball with his son in the backyard. Methodically. Grip, footwork, release point, follow-through. Jack understood the mechanics of throwing a football the way a concert pianist understands the mechanics of playing a scale. He broke the motion down into its component parts and taught each part separately before putting them together into a fluid, repeatable action. This early training gave John an advantage that is difficult to overstate. Most young quarterbacks learn to throw through trial and error, developing habits, both good and bad, that become ingrained over years of informal practice. John learned to throw the right way from the very beginning. His mechanics were clean, efficient, and powerful. His release was quick and compact. His spiral was tight. By the time he reached high school, his throwing motion was already more polished than that of many college quarterbacks. He had been coached, drilled, and refined by a man who understood the position at a granular level, and who had the patience and the expertise to develop his son's talent properly. The family moved frequently during John's childhood. This is something that is easy to overlook but important to understanding the person John became. Moving from town to town as a child means constantly being the new kid. It means walking into unfamiliar schools, facing unfamiliar faces, and having to establish yourself over and over again. For some children, this experience breeds insecurity. For John Elway, it seems to have bred adaptability and a fierce independence. He learned early that the quickest way to earn acceptance in a new school was through athletics. He was good at sports, all sports, and his talent opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Football was his primary sport, but he also excelled at baseball, basketball, and track. He was the kind of natural athlete who made everything look easy, the kind of kid who picked up a new sport and was the best player on the team within a week. The family settled in the San Fernando Valley area of Southern California when Jack took a coaching position at Cal State Northridge. John enrolled at Granada Hills High School, and it was there that his legend truly began. On the football field, he was devastating. His arm strength was already exceptional, and his ability to read defenses and process information quickly made him a terror for opposing coaches. He threw for over 3,000 yards as a senior, leading his team to the Los Angeles City Championship. He was named a Prep All-American and was recruited by virtually every major college football program in the country. But football was not his only option. John Elway was also an exceptional baseball player. He played outfield and hit with power, driving the ball over fences with a swing that was as natural and effortless as his throwing motion. His arm, that same right arm that could throw a football 70 yards, was equally devastating on the baseball diamond. He could throw a baseball from deep center field to home plate on a line. Professional baseball scouts watched him with the same covetous intensity that football recruiters brought to his games. The New York Yankees drafted him in the second round of the Major League Baseball amateur draft in 1979, and the offer was genuine. John Elway had a real choice to make, and for a time, it was not clear which sport he would choose. He chose football, but he kept his options open. He enrolled at Stanford University, drawn by both the academic reputation and the opportunity to play in the Pacific 10 Conference against elite competition. Stanford was not a traditional football powerhouse. It was an academic institution first and an athletic program second. The facilities were modest by the standards of the college football elite. The recruiting budget was limited. The roster was filled with smart, hard-working players who were good but not necessarily great by the standards of the national championship contenders. This was the environment John Elway entered, and he transformed it almost immediately. He became the starter as a sophomore in 1979 and held the position for 3 seasons. His numbers at Stanford were outstanding. Over his career, he completed roughly 53% of his passes for over 9,000 yards and 77 touchdowns. He was a consensus All-American as a senior and finished second in the Heisman Trophy voting in 1982, behind Herschel Walker of the University of Georgia. He was named the Pacific 10 Conference Player of the Year and was universally regarded as the finest college quarterback in the country. But the statistics only hinted at the reality of watching John Elway play football. The reality was electric. It was the way he moved in the pocket, sliding away from pressure with the fluid grace of a much smaller man. It was the way he launched deep balls that seemed to defy the laws of physics, spirals that traveled 50 or 60 yards through the air and arrived at their target with the precision of a guided missile. It was the way he scrambled, tucking the ball under his arm and running with a speed and power that stunned defensive players who were not prepared for a quarterback to beat them physically. And it was the way he competed. Every play, every game, every snap, Elway played with an intensity that was visible from the top row of the stadium. He hated losing with a passion that bordered on pathological. He would argue with coaches, berate teammates, and push himself to the point of exhaustion rather than accept defeat. This quality made him great, but it also made him difficult. Perfectionism is not always comfortable for the people who have to live with it. Stanford did not win a national championship during Elway's tenure. They did not even win a conference championship. The talent around him was simply not good enough. But Elway elevated the program far beyond what anyone could have reasonably expected, winning 27 of his 41 career starts and consistently keeping Stanford competitive against teams with superior rosters. His ability to carry a team was not theoretical. It was demonstrated game after game, season after season, in front of scouts and coaches who filled every seat in Stanford Stadium and left shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. The 1983 NFL Draft arrived with Elway as the consensus #1 pick. The Baltimore Colts held the first overall selection, and they chose him. But Elway had made it clear, privately and then publicly, that he did not want to play for Baltimore. The Colts were a struggling franchise, plagued by poor management and a deteriorating relationship with their home city. The coaching staff, led by head coach Frank Kush, did not inspire confidence. Elway and his father, who served as his advisor throughout the draft process, believed that Baltimore was not the right environment for a young quarterback to develop and succeed. Elway's refusal to play for the team that drafted him was controversial, to put it mildly. He was excoriated in the national media. Columnists called him a spoiled brat, a pampered California kid who thought he was too good for Baltimore. Fans of the Colts burned him in effigy. The debate about whether a drafted player had the right to refuse to play for the team that selected him became a national conversation that touched on issues of labor rights, player empowerment, and the power dynamics of professional sports. Elway had leverage because of his baseball option. The Yankees were still interested. If Baltimore refused to trade him, Elway could walk away from football entirely and play baseball. This was not a bluff. The Yankees had made him a legitimate offer, and there were people close to Elway who believed he had the talent to be a major league outfielder. The standoff lasted several weeks before the Colts relented and traded Elway to the Denver Broncos. The trade package Denver sent to Baltimore was significant. Offensive lineman Chris Hinton, who had been the 4th overall pick in the same draft. Quarterback Mark Herman, a backup, and Denver's first-round pick in the 1984 draft. It was a lot to give up. But the Broncos believed they were getting a franchise-altering talent, a once-in-a-generation quarterback who would define their organization for years to come. They were right, but the road ahead would be far more difficult than anyone anticipated. Elway's first season in Denver, 1983, was a humbling experience. He started 10 games, completing 47.5% of his passes with 7 touchdowns and 14 interceptions. The offense was built around the running game, and head coach Dan Reeves was not inclined to let a rookie quarterback air the ball out. The adjustment from college to professional football was immense. The defenses were faster, more complex, and more physical. The windows for throws were smaller. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Elway, who had been the best player on the field at every level he had ever played, was now struggling just to keep up. But there were moments, flashes of the brilliance that would define his career. A 60-yard bomb that landed perfectly in a receiver's hands. A scramble that left 3 defenders grasping at air. A fourth-quarter comeback that seemed to come from nowhere. These moments were enough to sustain hope, to remind the Broncos and their fans that the talent was real and that it was only a matter of time before it fully emerged. And it gets harder. Because even as Elway was learning to navigate the complexities of professional football, he was also taking on a burden that few athletes in any sport have ever been asked to carry. The Denver Broncos of the mid-1980s were built around John Elway, not in the way that a well-rounded team features a star player, in the way that a building is built around its foundation. Without Elway, the entire structure collapsed. The offensive line was adequate but not elite. The receiving corps was workmanlike, composed of solid professionals who could run routes and catch the ball, but who lacked the game-breaking ability of the elite receivers in the league. The running game was inconsistent. The defense was good in some years and mediocre in others. Elway was the difference. He was the margin between winning and losing, between making the playoffs and watching from home, between being a contender and being an also-ran. Week after week, he performed acts of individual brilliance that had no right to succeed. He escaped sacks that should have been losses. He completed passes that should have been interceptions. He led comebacks that should have been impossible. The fans at Mile High Stadium, a cavernous outdoor stadium in Denver that was one of the loudest venues in professional football, worshipped him. They wore his number 7 jersey. They chanted his name. They believed, with a faith that transcended logic, that as long as number 7 was on the field, the Broncos had a chance. This was the reality of John Elway's career for nearly 15 years. He was Atlas, holding the sky. He was the indispensable man, the one player whose presence transformed a mediocre roster into a championship contender. And the weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that if he had a bad game his team would lose, that there was no safety net, no margin for error, no one to share the burden, shaped him in ways that were not always visible to the public. It made him harder. It made him more demanding. It made him at times less patient with the failings of others than a teammate might ideally be. But it also made him relentless. It burned away any capacity for complacency and left behind a pure, white-hot competitive fire that never diminished. Not in his first season, not in his 10th, not in his 16th and final year. The relationship between Elway and head coach Dan Reeves was the central tension of the first decade of his career. Reeves was a former Dallas Cowboys running back who had learned the game under the great Tom Landry. He believed in discipline, structure, and the running game. He wanted his quarterback to manage the game, to avoid turnovers, to take what the defense gave him, and to trust the system. Elway wanted to throw the football. He wanted to create. He wanted the freedom to improvise when the play broke down. He wanted to be unleashed. This conflict was not unusual. The history of the NFL is filled with battles between coaches who want control and quarterbacks who want freedom. But the Elway-Reeves conflict was particularly intense because both men were stubborn, proud, and convinced that their vision of how to play football was correct. Reeves saw Elway's improvisations as undisciplined. Elway saw Reeves's play calling as conservative and limiting. They coexisted because they had to, because they needed each other, but the friction between them was a constant presence in the Broncos locker room for a decade. It simmered through the good times and boiled over during the bad, and it would eventually contribute to Reeves's firing after the 1992 season. Despite this tension, the Elway-era Broncos were consistently competitive. They made the playoffs in 9 of Elway's first 11 seasons. They won the AFC Championship 3 times in 4 years, in 1986, 1987, and 1989. They were, without question, one of the best teams in the American Football Conference for the better part of a decade, and the driving force behind all of it was the quarterback with the rocket arm and the relentless will, who refused to let his team be anything less than a contender. The 1986 season was the year Elway first announced himself to the national consciousness as something more than a talented young quarterback. The Broncos went 11-5 during the regular season, earning a playoff berth. They won their first postseason game and then traveled to Cleveland to face the Browns in the AFC Championship game, the winner advancing to the Super Bowl. Cleveland was favored. They were playing at home in the cavernous municipal stadium by the lakefront, a hostile environment filled with 80,000 screaming fans. The Browns had a dominant defense and a solid running game. They led 20-13 late in the fourth quarter. The Broncos received the ball at their own 2-yard line with 5 minutes and 32 seconds remaining on the clock, 98 yards from the end zone. The situation appeared hopeless. What happened next became the defining moment of Elway's career and one of the most celebrated sequences in the history of professional football. Elway stepped into the huddle on his own 2-yard line, looked at his teammates, and according to multiple witnesses, smiled. He told them they were going to drive the length of the field and score. Then he proceeded to do exactly that. He completed 5 of 8 passes on the drive. He scrambled for 11 yards on one crucial play. He converted 2 third-down situations that seemed impossible. The noise in Cleveland was so intense that the Broncos could not hear each other in the huddle. The field was frozen. The wind whipped off Lake Erie. None of it mattered. Elway was in a state that athletes sometimes describe as the zone, a heightened awareness in which the game slows down and every action feels inevitable. He drove his team 98 yards in 15 plays, finishing with a 5-yard touchdown pass to wide receiver Mark Jackson that tied the game at 20. Denver won in overtime on a field goal by Rich Karlis. The game became known forever after as The Drive. That drive did not just win a football game, it created a mythology. It established John Elway as the numback quarterback, the man you could never count out, the player who was most dangerous when the situation was most desperate. Coaches, players, and fans across the league began to understand that no lead was safe against Denver as long as number 7 was on the field. The drive became shorthand for competitive will, for the refusal to accept defeat, for the belief that one man with enough talent and enough determination could bend the outcome of a game to his will. But the euphoria of the drive was short-lived. 2 weeks later, in Super Bowl 21 in Pasadena, California, the Broncos faced the New York Giants. Denver was competitive in the first half, trailing just 10-9. Then the second half began, and the Giants unleashed a devastating offensive performance that buried the Broncos. New York scored 30 points in the second half. The final score was 39-20. Elway completed only half of his passes and threw 1 interception. It was a thorough, humiliating defeat on the biggest stage in American sports. The following season, 1987, the Broncos returned to the Super Bowl again, this time facing the Washington franchise. Super Bowl 22 was, if anything, even more devastating than the first loss. Washington scored 35 points in the second quarter alone, an onslaught so sudden and so complete that it left the Denver sideline in a state of visible shock. Quarterback Doug Williams was magnificent, throwing 4 touchdown passes in that single quarter. The final score was 42-10. Elway was sacked 5 times and completed only half of his passes. The loss was so lopsided, so overwhelming, that it prompted questions about whether Elway and the Broncos were simply not equipped to compete at the highest level. 2 years later, in Super Bowl 24, the Broncos were destroyed by the San Francisco 49ers, 55-10. Joe Montana threw 5 touchdown passes. Jerry Rice caught 7 passes for nearly 150 yards and 3 touchdowns. The 49ers scored touchdowns on 6 consecutive possessions in the second half. It was the most lopsided Super Bowl in history at that point, and it was the 3rd blowout loss in 4 years for Elway and Denver. The combined score of those 3 Super Bowls was 136-40. It was not close. It was never close. The Broncos had been exposed on the grandest stage in American sports, and the exposure was brutal. These 3 losses carved a scar into John Elway's legacy that took years to heal. He became, in the national conversation, the quarterback who could get you to the Super Bowl but could not win once he arrived. The comparison to Montana was devastating. Montana had won 3 Super Bowls by that point, soon to be 4, and had been named the game's most valuable player twice. Montana was a champion. Elway was a loser. That was the narrative, and it hardened with each passing year. The early 1990s were a transitional period for both Elway and the Broncos. Reeves was fired after the 1992 season, replaced first by Wade Phillips and then, in 1995, by Mike Shanahan. The roster turned over. The offense changed. The defense changed. Elway himself changed, evolving from the freewheeling improviser of his youth into a more disciplined, more patient quarterback who understood that sometimes the best play was the simple play. He still had the arm. He still had the mobility, though it was diminishing with age. He still had the fire. But he was learning, slowly and painfully, the lessons that only years of failure can teach. He was learning that he could not do it alone, that he needed help. That winning a championship required not just individual brilliance, but collective excellence at every position on the field. The arrival of Mike Shanahan was the turning point. Shanahan brought with him a zone-blocking running scheme that would transform the Denver offense and, ultimately, John Elway's career. The system emphasized precision blocking and cutback running lanes, and it required smart, disciplined, offensive linemen rather than massive, powerful ones. When the system worked, it was devastatingly effective, creating running lanes that seemed to open up out of nowhere. For the first time in Elway's career, the Broncos had a genuinely potent running game, one that could carry the offense and take pressure off the passing attack. And then came Terrell Davis, a 6th-round draft pick in 1995, who had been overlooked by virtually every team in the league. Davis was not the biggest running back. He was not the fastest. But he had an extraordinary combination of vision, power, and determination that made him perfect for Shanahan's system. In his second season, 1996, Davis rushed for over 1,500 yards and became one of the most productive running backs in the league. The Broncos went 13-3 that year and earned the number 1 seed in the AFC playoffs. For the first time in Elway's career, the team was not dependent solely on him. There was a running game, there was a scheme, there was a supporting cast that could hold its own. The 1996 playoff run ended in heartbreak when the Broncos lost at home to the Jacksonville Jaguars, a second-year expansion team that had no business being on the same field with Denver. The loss was devastating, perhaps the most painful defeat of Elway's career, precisely because the expectations had been so high. He was 36 years old. The window was closing. The narrative was calcifying. John Elway could not win the big one. He could get close, he could lead comebacks and throw touchdowns and fill stadiums with screaming fans. But when the lights were brightest, when the stakes were highest, he could not deliver. What most people did not see during this period was the toll that years of losing on the biggest stage were taking on Elway personally. He has spoken about this only in fragments, in brief moments of candor scattered across interviews over the years. But the picture that emerges is one of a man who internalized every loss, every criticism, every whispered suggestion that he was not a winner when it mattered most. The Super Bowl losses were not just professional setbacks, they were personal wounds. Each one cut deeper than the last. The first was disappointing. The second was humiliating. The third was crushing. And the cumulative weight of all 3 created a psychological burden that Elway carried into every subsequent season, every subsequent playoff game, every subsequent moment when the stakes rose high enough to remind him of what had happened before. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from being almost good enough, from being great at your craft, universally recognized as one of the best to ever play, and yet falling short at the moment that defines greatness. It is different from the suffering of the mediocre player who never gets close enough to the summit to feel the cold air of near achievement. It is the suffering of the man who can see the top of the mountain, who has climbed to within arm's reach of the peak, and who has been knocked back down 3 times. Each ascent takes more out of you, each fall hurts more, and each time you stand up and begin climbing again, you carry the weight of every previous fall on your back. Elway kept climbing. That is the essential truth of his career. He kept climbing when every reasonable voice in his head must have been telling him to stop. He kept climbing when the critics said he was finished. He kept climbing when his body began to break down, when his knees ached and his back tightened, and the recovery from each game took a little longer than it had the year before. He was not a young man anymore. He was approaching his late 30s, an age at which most quarterbacks have retired or declined significantly. But he was still there, still competing, still believing that the moment would come. And in 1997, it finally did. The Broncos entered that season with a quiet confidence that had not been present in previous years. The roster was stronger and more balanced than any team Elway had played on before. Davis was entering his 3rd season and was primed for a breakout campaign. The offensive line, coached by Alex Gibbs, was executing Shanahan's zone-blocking scheme with precision and consistency. Tight end Shannon Sharp was one of the best pass-catching tight ends in the league. A dynamic weapon who gave Elway a reliable target in the middle of the field. Wide receiver Rod Smith, an undrafted free agent who had worked his way onto the roster through sheer determination, had emerged as a legitimate deep threat. And the defense, while not dominant, was aggressive and opportunistic, led by veteran players like defensive end Neil Smith, safety Steve Atwater, and linebacker Bill Romanowski. For the first time in his career, Elway looked around the huddle and saw a team that was genuinely capable of winning a championship. Not a team that needed him to perform miracles every Sunday just to stay competitive. A team that could win games in multiple ways. Through the run, through the pass, through defense, through special teams. A team that could support him rather than depend on him. This was a subtle but profound shift, and it changed the way Elway played. He was calmer, he was more efficient. He was more willing to take what the defense gave him, to check the ball down rather than force it deep, to trust his running back and his offensive line to carry the load. He was not a diminished version of himself. He was a more evolved version, a quarterback who had been through so much, who had learned so many lessons the hard way, that he finally understood what it took to win at the highest level. The 1997 regular season was excellent. Denver went 12-4, earning a playoff berth and a path to the Super Bowl. Davis rushed for over 1,700 yards and was emerging as one of the most dominant running backs in the sport. Elway threw for over 3,000 yards with 27 touchdowns, solid numbers for a 37-year-old quarterback in a run-first offense. The team was playing its best football at the right time, peaking as the postseason approached. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. The story of John Elway's career is in many ways a story told in moments, not in statistics or standings or season records, though all of those are impressive, but in individual moments, frozen in time, that capture something essential about who he was and what he was willing to endure. There are 5 such moments that define him more clearly than any biography or highlight reel ever could. The first moment is the drive itself, and while it has already been described in broad strokes, it deserves a deeper examination, because the details reveal something that the summary cannot. It was January 11th, 1987, the AFC Championship game, Cleveland Municipal Stadium, temperature in the mid-30s, wind coming off Lake Erie, adding a bitter chill that cut through even the heaviest winter coats. The crowd was enormous and hostile, approximately 79,000 fans, packed into a stadium that was already legendary for the intensity of its atmosphere. The dog pound, A section of bleachers in one end zone populated by the most passionate and vocal of the Cleveland faithful was in full throat. They were drunk on cheap beer and the certainty that their team was about to reach the Super Bowl for the first time in over 2 decades. The Browns led 20-13. Denver had the ball on its own 2-yard line. 5 minutes and 32 seconds remained. In the press box, television commentators were already composing their narratives about Cleveland's triumph. On the Denver sideline, the mood was subdued. Not defeated exactly, but close. Even the most optimistic person in a Denver uniform understood the improbability of what needed to happen. A 98-yard drive against one of the best defenses in the conference, in one of the loudest stadiums in the league. With the season on the line, Elway began the drive with a 5-yard completion to running back Sammy Winder, then an 11-yard completion to Steve Sewell, then an incomplete pass, then a sack that pushed Denver back to the 15-yard line. 3rd down and 18. The drive appeared to be over before it had really begun. 3rd and 18 from your own 15-yard line with the entire stadium screaming at a volume that makes some communication almost impossible. This is the moment when most drives die. This is the moment when the ball is punted away and the game is over and the bus ride to the airport is long and silent. Elway dropped back and found wide receiver Mark Jackson for a 20-yard completion. 1st down. Life. The drive continued. Elway completed passes to Steve Watson and Vance Johnson. He scrambled for 11 yards on a crucial 3rd down play, a run that showed not just his athletic ability, but his willingness to put his body at risk when the moment demanded it. The crowd grew quieter with each 1st down, as if they could feel the momentum shifting beneath their feet like tectonic plates. By the time the Broncos reached the Cleveland 30-yard line, the atmosphere had changed completely. The certainty that had filled the stadium 10 minutes earlier had been replaced by something close to dread. Cleveland's fans knew what was happening. They had seen it before, in other games, in other years, that feeling of watching a great player refuse to accept the outcome that everyone else has already conceded. The drive stalled briefly near the red zone, but Elway would not let it die. On 3rd down from the 5-yard line, he dropped back and hit Jackson in the end zone for the tying touchdown. The extra point made it 20-20. The game went to overtime, where Rich Karlis kicked a field goal to give Denver the victory and a trip to the Super Bowl. 98 yards, 15 plays, 5 minutes and 2 seconds of game time. Those are the numbers, but the numbers do not capture the feeling. They do not capture the silence that descended on Cleveland Municipal Stadium as the tying touchdown was scored. The eerie quiet of 80,000 people simultaneously losing hope. They do not capture the look on Elway's face in the huddle throughout the drive, a look of calm determination that his teammates would later describe as almost supernatural. And they do not capture the significance of the moment for Elway personally, the way it confirmed, once and for all, that he was capable of performing at the highest level when the pressure was at its absolute peak. The drive did not just win a game, it created a standard. It established the benchmark against which every subsequent Elway comeback would be measured, and it established Elway as the most dangerous late-game quarterback in professional football. It also established a cruel paradox that would haunt Elway for years. The drive raised expectations to a level that was almost impossible to sustain. From that moment forward, every game was filtered through the lens of that 98-yard masterpiece. Every fourth-quarter deficit was an opportunity for Elway to do it again. Every comeback was measured against that one. And every failure, every game that Elway could not pull out of the fire, was treated as a disappointment rather than a normal outcome. The drive made Elway a legend, but it also made him a prisoner of his own mythology. Over the course of his career, Elway would engineer 47 game-winning drives in the fourth quarter or overtime. 47 times he would look at a deficit on the scoreboard, look at the clock ticking towards zero, and find a way to pull victory from what appeared to be certain defeat. That number was a record when he retired, and it stood for years. It is a staggering testament to his competitiveness, his arm talent, and his ability to perform under the most extreme pressure a football player can face. But it is also a testament to the reality of his situation. The reason Elway needed to lead so many comebacks was that his team so often fell behind. The rosters around him particularly in the first decade of his career, were not good enough to build comfortable leads and hold them. They needed Elway to rescue them, and he did, again and again, with a consistency that should have been impossible. There were rivalries that shaped this era, too. The Broncos' battles with the Cleveland Browns in the late 1980s were the most intense. Cleveland felt that Elway had stolen their Super Bowl berth in 1986 with the drive. The rematch in the 1987 AFC Championship game added another painful chapter. In that game, the Broncos took a lead into the final minutes, but the Browns drove deep into Denver territory, threatening to tie the game. Running back Ernest Biner took a handoff and appeared to be heading for the tying touchdown when Denver cornerback Jeremiah Castile stripped the ball from his hands at the 3-yard line. The fumble was recovered by Denver, and the Broncos held on to win and return to the Super Bowl. Cleveland fans would call this play the fumble, their own moment of devastating heartbreak, the mirror image of the drive from the year before. The two plays, the drive and the fumble, became linked in football lore, twin pillars of Denver's dominance and Cleveland's despair in the 1980s. There was also the rivalry with the Kansas City Chiefs, a division rival that Elway faced twice every season for 16 years. The Broncos and Chiefs battles were physical, emotional, and deeply personal. Kansas City's defenses during this era were among the most fearsome in the league, led at various times by players like Derek Thomas, Neil Smith before he joined Denver, and Albert Lewis. Thomas, a pass-rushing linebacker with extraordinary speed and explosiveness, was Elway's most persistent tormentor. In one game during the 1990 season, Thomas sacked Elway 7 times, an individual performance so dominant that it became one of the most famous defensive displays in NFL history. The game ended in a Denver victory, however, because Elway, despite absorbing those 7 sacks, managed to throw a touchdown pass on the final play to steal the win. It was a quintessential Elway performance, battered, bruised, sacked more times than any quarterback should endure, and still finding a way to win. The battles with the Raiders, another AFC West rival, were equally intense. The Oakland and later Los Angeles Raiders brought a physicality and an attitude to every game that tested Elway's toughness. Howie Long, the Raiders' fearsome defensive lineman, was a constant threat. The games between Denver and the Raiders in the 1980s were played with a hostility that sometimes crossed the line from competitive into genuinely dangerous. Elway absorbed punishing hits in those games, taking shots that would have ended lesser careers, but he never missed significant time due to injury during his playing career, a testament to both his physical toughness and his ability to sense pressure and avoid the worst of the punishment. The second defining moment of Elway's career was not a triumph but a tragedy of timing. It was the death of his father, Jack Elway, on April 15, 1993. Jack was 69 years old. He had been suffering from health issues, and his death was not entirely unexpected. But the loss devastated John in ways that went beyond the normal grief of losing a parent. Jack Elway was not just John's father. He was his first coach, his most important teacher, and the man who had shaped his understanding of football from the very beginning. Every lesson John had ever learned about throwing a football, about reading a defense, about competing with everything you had, traced back to Jack. Their bond was forged not just in blood, but in shared obsession. Thousands of hours spent on practice fields, and in film rooms, and in the car driving between games. Football was their common language, the medium through which they expressed their love and their ambition and their drive. And when Jack died, that language lost its most important speaker. The timing of Jack's death added a layer of tragedy that is difficult to overstate. In 1993, John was 32 years old, in the prime of his career. He had already been to 3 Super Bowls and lost all 3. The championship that would have validated everything Jack had taught him, everything they had built together, had not yet been achieved. Jack went to his grave not knowing whether his son would ever win the big one. He went to his grave carrying the weight of those 3 Super Bowl losses alongside John, knowing that the son he had raised and trained and believed in had not yet received the ultimate reward for his efforts. This is a burden that no parent should have to bear and no son should have to remember. John has spoken about his father's death in measured, careful terms over the years, revealing just enough to suggest the depth of his grief without exposing it fully to public view. He has said that his father would have been proud of him. He has said that he thought about his father every time he took the field after 1993. He has said that winning the Super Bowl without Jack there to see it was both the greatest joy and the deepest sadness of his professional life. These are the statements of a man who is choosing his words with great care, who is sharing what he can while protecting the parts of his grief that belong only to him. There is a tradition in professional football and in sports more broadly of dedicating victories to people who are no longer alive to witness them. Players point to the sky after scoring touchdowns. They wear patches on their uniforms bearing the initials of lost loved ones. They speak at press conferences about playing for someone who is watching from somewhere beyond the reach of television cameras and scoreboards. These gestures are sincere and moving, but they also acknowledge a truth that is both comforting and devastating. The people we lose do not get to share our triumphs. We can honor them. We can carry their memory with us onto the field and into the arena, but we cannot give them the one thing they would want most, which is to be there, to be present, to see it with their own eyes and feel it in their own hearts. The absence of Jack Elway at Super Bowl 32 and Super Bowl 33 is one of the most poignant footnotes in the history of the sport. The man who put the football in John's hands, who taught him to grip it, who drilled the mechanics into him over thousands of hours of practice, who moved the family across the country to give his son the best possible opportunity to develop his talent, was not there when all of that work finally culminated in the ultimate prize. He died 4.5 years before John's first Super Bowl victory. He never saw the helicopter play. He never saw the tears of joy on his son's face. He never held the Lombardi trophy. The cruelty of that timing is something that no amount of success can fully overcome. The third defining moment was Super Bowl 32, played on January 25, 1998, in San Diego, California. The Denver Broncos against the Green Bay Packers. It was the game that changed everything. The game that redeemed Elway. The game that finally silenced the voices that had spent a decade calling him a loser on the biggest stage. Green Bay was favored by 11.5 points. This was not a close line. The Packers had won the Super Bowl the previous year, defeating the New England Patriots convincingly. They had Brett Favre, the reigning league most valuable player, at quarterback. They had Reggie White, the Minister of Defense, one of the most dominant pass rushers in NFL history. They had a roster loaded with talent at every position, and they were facing a Denver team that, for all its improvement under Shanahan, was still led by a 37-year-old quarterback with a career Super Bowl record of 0-3. The national media treated the game as a coronation for Green Bay. The question was not whether the Packers would win, but by how much. The Broncos did not care about the betting line. They came out and played with an aggressiveness and a confidence that startled the Packers from the opening possession. Terrell Davis, despite suffering from a migraine headache so severe that it partially blinded him during the second quarter, ran the ball with devastating power. Elway threw with precision and purpose. The offensive line blocked with a fury that the Packers had not expected. The defense bent but did not break, creating turnovers at critical moments. The game was competitive from start to finish, with neither team able to pull away. The numbers are striking when you examine that game in detail. Davis finished with 157 yards rushing on 30 carries and scored 3 touchdowns, earning the Super Bowl Most Valuable Player award. Elway completed 12 of 22 passes for 123 yards. Those are not eye-popping passing numbers. They are the numbers of a quarterback who was managing the game, who was letting his running back carry the load, who was making the throws he needed to make without trying to do too much. It was the most disciplined, most mature performance of Elway's career. But the moment that defined the game, and perhaps Elway's entire legacy, came in the third quarter. Denver was driving. Elway took the snap, saw an opening, and took off running on a designed quarterback draw. He headed toward the first down marker near the left sideline. Green Bay safety Leroy Butler came up to make the tackle. So did linebacker Brian Williams. Elway could have slid or run out of bounds. He could have taken the safe route, the route that a 37-year-old quarterback with a history of injuries should have taken. Instead, he lowered his shoulder and launched himself into the defenders. What happened next was extraordinary. Butler and Williams hit Elway simultaneously, one from the front and one from the side. The impact spun Elway's body in a full rotation, a helicopter-like spin that carried him through the air for a terrifying, beautiful moment before he crashed to the ground. He landed beyond the first down marker, and then he popped up. He jumped to his feet and pumped his fist, and the expression on his face was one of pure, defiant, almost savage joy. It was the face of a man who had been waiting 15 years for this moment, and who was not going to let anything, not the Packers, not his age, not the laws of physics, take it away from him. The helicopter play was not the biggest play of the game in terms of yards or points. It was a first down. That is all it was on the stat sheet. But it was the most important play of Elway's career because of what it symbolized. It symbolized his refusal to be denied, his willingness to sacrifice his body, his determination to win this game, this one, no matter the cost. The crowd in San Diego erupted. The Broncos sideline went wild. And across America, millions of people watching on television understood that they were seeing something they had never seen before and would never see again. They were seeing the heart of John Elway, laid bare on a football field, compressed into a single spinning, gravity-defying moment. Denver won the game 31-24. When the clock expired, Elway stood on the field with tears in his eyes. His teammates surrounded him. Confetti fell from the sky. Somewhere in the stadium, a public address announcer was saying words that Elway could not hear over the roaring in his ears. He had done it. After 15 years, after 3 blowout losses, after a decade of being told he was not good enough, he had done it. He had won the Super Bowl. The locker room, after that game, was one of the most emotional scenes in the history of professional football. Grown men, players who had spent their entire careers fighting to maintain an image of toughness and stoicism, wept openly. They hugged each other. They hugged Elway. Owner Pat Bowlen held the Lombardi Trophy above his head and uttered a phrase that would become legendary in Denver sports history. He pointed at his quarterback and dedicated the championship to him. The trophy, he said, belonged to John. That moment, the owner of a professional football team publicly dedicating a championship to his quarterback, spoke volumes about the nature of Elway's relationship with the franchise. Bowlen understood what Denver owed to Elway. The Broncos had been a respectable franchise before Elway arrived. They had one Super Bowl appearance. They had a loyal fan base. They had a history. But they did not have a legend. They did not have a transcendent figure who elevated the entire organization into the upper tier of professional sports franchises. Elway gave them that. He gave them relevance. He gave them identity. He gave them something to be proud of on a national stage. And Bowlen, a shrewd businessman who understood the value of such things, was grateful enough to say so publicly in the most important moment of his ownership. The weeks that followed Super Bowl 32 were a blur of celebration for Denver. There was a parade through the streets of the city that drew an estimated 650,000 people, one of the largest gatherings in Colorado history. The celebration spilled out of the downtown area and into neighborhoods and suburbs, a city-wide outpouring of joy that transcended demographic lines. Young people and old people, lifelong fans and casual observers, people who had never watched a football game in their lives, but who understood on some fundamental level that something important had happened. Denver had a champion, and the champion was John Elway. But amid the celebration, there was already a quiet understanding that this moment might not last. Elway was 37. His body was aging. The window of opportunity, which had been closed for so long and had now been pried open by the combination of Shanahan's coaching, Davis's running, and Elway's indomitable will, could close again at any time. The 1998 season was not guaranteed. Nothing was guaranteed. And so the celebration, joyous as it was, carried within it a seed of urgency. There might not be another chance. This might be it. Make it count. It was this urgency that fueled the Broncos through the 1998 season and into their second consecutive Super Bowl appearance. The team was motivated not just by the desire to win, but by the awareness that they were playing in the twilight of an era. Elway's career was nearing its end. Everyone knew it, and the knowledge that each game might be one of the last he would ever play gave every victory an added weight and every defeat an added sting. The fourth defining moment came 1 year later, in Super Bowl 33, played on January 31st, 1999, in Miami, Florida. The Broncos were back, and this time they were defending champions. Their opponent was the Atlanta Falcons, an unlikely Super Bowl participant led by quarterback Chris Chandler and running back Jamal Anderson. Atlanta had gone 14-2 in the regular season and had earned the right to play in the biggest game in sports. But they were heavy underdogs against a Denver team that was even better than the one that had beaten Green Bay the year before. The 1998 regular season had been extraordinary for Denver. They went 14-2. Davis rushed for 2,008 yards, becoming only the fourth running back in NFL history to rush for more than 2,000 yards in a single season. He was named the league's most valuable player. The defense was improved, more physical and more consistent than the previous year. And Elway, at 38 years old, was playing with a serene confidence that came from knowing, for the first time in his career, that the pressure of winning a championship had been lifted from his shoulders. He had already won one. The narrative had been rewritten. The monkey was off his back. He was free to simply play football, and the liberation of that freedom showed in every aspect of his game. The 1998 playoff run was methodical and dominant. The Broncos dispatched the Miami Dolphins in the divisional round, winning 38-3 in a performance that was as close to perfection as a playoff team can achieve. Elway was sharp. Davis was unstoppable. The defense suffocated the Miami offense. The following week, Denver faced the New York Jets in the AFC Championship game. The Jets, coached by Bill Parcells and quarterbacked by Vinny Testaverde, had been one of the surprise teams of the season, but they were no match for Denver. The Broncos won 23-10, a game that was never really in doubt, and earned their second consecutive trip to the Super Bowl. There was a question that hung over the Denver Broncos as they prepared for Super Bowl 33. It was a question that had nothing to do with football strategy or game planning. The question was whether John Elway would retire after the game. Rumors had been circulating for weeks. Elway had not committed either way publicly, but the signs pointed toward retirement. His body was breaking down, his knees were arthritic, his back ached constantly. The cumulative toll of 16 seasons, of thousands of hits absorbed and thousands of scrambles executed, had left him in physical condition that made continuing to play increasingly difficult. He was 38 years old. He had won a Super Bowl. If he won another, there would be nothing left to achieve. The stage was set for a farewell. Super Bowl 33 was not a dramatic game. It was a professional dismantling. Denver took control early and never relinquished it. Elway was superb, completing 18 of 29 passes for 336 yards, with 1 touchdown and 1 interception. He also ran for a touchdown, a 3-yard scramble, in the fourth quarter that put the game out of reach. His 80-yard touchdown pass to Rod Smith in the first half was one of the longest completions in Super Bowl history, a throw that showcased the arm strength that had been Elway's trademark for his entire career. At 38 years old, he could still throw the ball as far as any quarterback in the league. He was named the Super Bowl Most Valuable Player, the first and only Super Bowl MVP award of his career. The final score was 34-19. What made that game particularly meaningful was the context surrounding it. Davis, who had been the engine of the Denver offense for the previous 2 seasons, suffered a knee injury during the game that would ultimately end his career. He tore his anterior cruciate ligament, the same devastating knee injury that had claimed so many football careers before his. Davis tried to continue playing but could not. He was helped off the field, and though he would attempt a comeback in subsequent seasons, he would never again be the dominant force he had been. The cruelty of the timing was not lost on anyone. Davis had helped deliver Elway to the championship, and in the final game of Elway's career, Davis's own career was effectively ended. The celebration after Super Bowl 33 was more subdued than the wild euphoria that had followed the Green Bay victory a year earlier. There was joy, certainly, but there was also a sense of finality, of endings, that gave the evening a bittersweet quality. Elway knew this was his last game. His teammates suspected it. The fans watching from their living rooms across America sensed it. The last confetti had barely settled before the questions began. Was this the end? Was John Elway done? The image from that game that stays with you is not a single play. It is the final moments. As the clock wound down and the outcome was no longer in doubt, the cameras found Elway on the Denver sideline. He was sitting on the bench, helmet off, staring at the field. He was not celebrating. Not yet. He was absorbing the moment, taking it in, understanding that this was the last game he would ever play, that this was the end of a journey that had begun on the practice fields of his father's teams 3 decades earlier. The stadium was alive with noise, the roar of Broncos fans celebrating a second consecutive championship, but Elway seemed to exist in a pocket of silence within the chaos. His expression was contemplative, almost serene, the face of a man who was watching his life's work reach its conclusion and finding, at last, that the conclusion was everything he had hoped it would be. When the game ended, he was hoisted onto the shoulders of his teammates and carried off the field, a champion for the second consecutive year, his legacy secured beyond any argument. There were tears that night. Elway cried on the field. He cried in the locker room. He cried in the press conference. These were not the tears of a man who was sad. They were the tears of a man who was overwhelmed by the weight of everything he had carried for so long and the relief of finally being able to set it down. 16 seasons, 234 regular season games, 22 playoff games, 3 devastating losses on the biggest stage, and now 2 victories that washed it all clean. The 5th and final defining moment was the retirement itself. On May 2nd, 1999, John Elway announced that he was walking away from professional football. The press conference was held at the Broncos facility in Dove Valley, Colorado, and it was attended by a massive gathering of media, teammates, coaches, and dignitaries. Elway had known for months that he was going to retire, but the announcement still hit Denver like a thunderclap. The quarterback who had defined the franchise for 16 years was leaving. The era was over. The deliberation leading up to that announcement was more agonizing than most people realized. Elway spent weeks consulting with doctors, family members, teammates, and coaches. His body was telling him to stop. His knees were bone on bone, in places the cartilage worn away by 16 seasons of absorbing punishment. His back was a constant source of pain. He had tendinitis in his elbow that required regular treatment just to allow him to throw. He was not the physical specimen he had been at 22 or even 32. He was a 38-year-old man whose body had been pushed to its limits and beyond for nearly 2 decades. The toll was substantial, and it would only increase with each additional season, but his competitive spirit was telling him to keep playing. That was the tension at the heart of the decision. Elway did not want to retire. He wanted to play forever. The fire that had driven him since childhood, the relentless need to compete and win that was as fundamental to his identity as his right arm, did not acknowledge the reality of aging or injury. It simply demanded more games, more comebacks, more chances to prove himself. Walking away from football meant walking away from the thing that had defined him for as long as he could remember. It meant confronting a question that terrified him more than any blitzing linebacker ever had. Who am I without football? The decision to retire was, in the end, a choice to leave on his own terms. Elway looked at the landscape and understood that he had achieved the rarest of outcomes in professional sports. He had won back-to-back championships. He had been named Super Bowl MVP. He had answered every question that had ever been asked about his legacy. The ending was perfect. To continue playing would be to risk tarnishing that ending, to risk the slow decline that had diminished so many great players before him. Joe Namath had stayed too long. Johnny Unitas had stayed too long. Elway was not going to make that mistake. Elway's retirement speech was emotional in a way that surprised many people who thought they knew him. He had always been composed in public, a man who kept his emotions under tight control. But on that day, the control slipped. He talked about his teammates, past and present, and how much they had meant to him. He talked about the fans, about the way their support had sustained him through the darkest periods of his career. He talked about Shanahan and the coaching staff. He talked about the Boland family, the owners of the Broncos, who had given him a home for 16 years. And he talked about his father. When he spoke about Jack, his voice broke. The room went silent. For a long moment, the only sound was the whirring of camera motors and the quiet rustle of people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, moved by the raw emotion of a man they had watched play football for nearly 2 decades. What Elway did not say that day was as revealing as what he did say. He did not talk about the records. He did not talk about the statistics. He did not recite his accomplishments or list his awards. He talked about people, about relationships, about gratitude. For a man who had spent his entire career being defined by what he achieved on a football field, the retirement speech was notable for its focus on the human connections that had sustained him along the way. The touchdowns and the comebacks and the Super Bowl victories were important, but they were not what mattered most. What mattered most were the people. The teammates who had blocked for him and caught his passes and celebrated with him and grieved with him through 16 seasons of shared struggle. The fans who had filled the stadium on cold Sunday afternoons and screamed his name until their voices gave out. The family who had loved him even when the losses made him difficult to love. There was a finality to that press conference that Denver felt deeply. The city had known this day was coming. They had prepared for it, in the way that people prepare for the inevitable loss of something precious, by trying not to think about it too much and hoping it would not arrive as soon as expected. But when it came, when Elway stood at the podium and said the words that everyone had been dreading, the weight of it was heavier than anyone had anticipated. Denver was losing more than a quarterback. They were losing their identity. For 16 years, the city had defined itself through John Elway. He was the reason people in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago knew that Denver was more than a mountain town with thin air and ski resorts. He was the reason the Broncos mattered on the national stage. He was the reason the city had 2 Super Bowl trophies sitting in a case at the team's facility. Without him, who were the Denver Broncos? Without him, who was Denver? These are unfair questions to place on the shoulders of a football player. No one should have to carry the identity of an entire city, but Elway carried it for 16 years without complaint, and when he finally set it down, the city felt the absence, the way you feel the absence of something you have taken for granted for so long that you forgot it was there. It was only when it was gone that you understood how much it had meant. The arc of John Elway's career, from the draft day controversy of 1983 to the retirement press conference of 1999, is one of the great narrative arcs in the history of American sports. It has everything: the prodigious talent, the early struggles, the heartbreaking losses, the years of doubt and frustration, the late career resurgence, the redemptive victories, the emotional farewell. It is a story that could not have been better scripted by the finest Hollywood writers, and yet it is entirely, undeniably, beautifully real. There is one additional detail about the arc of these career-defining moments that deserves attention. It is the way that each moment built upon the previous ones, creating a cumulative narrative that became more powerful with each passing year. The drive in 1987 established Elway as a clutch performer. The 3 Super Bowl losses established the tension, the unresolved question of whether clutch performances in the regular season and playoffs could translate to the ultimate stage. The death of Jack in 1993 added emotional depth to the narrative, raising the stakes beyond football and into the realm of family, legacy, and the passage of time. Super Bowl 32 provided the climactic resolution, the moment when all the years of pain and doubt were finally answered. Super Bowl 33 confirmed the resolution and provided the coda, and the retirement brought the curtain down on a story that had held the nation's attention for 16 years. This is not the structure of a typical athletic career. Most careers do not have this kind of narrative coherence. Most athletes have scattered moments of greatness and stretches of mediocrity that do not add up to a single, unified story. Elway's career was different. It had the structure of a novel, with a clear beginning, a rising action, a crisis, a climax, and a resolution. It felt, at times, as though some unseen author were shaping events to create the maximum possible drama and emotional impact. The early successes that set the stage, the devastating failures that created the doubt, the long years of perseverance that built the tension, and the late career triumphs that resolved everything in a burst of joy and relief that felt earned in a way that easy victories never can. The reason people still talk about John Elway, the reason his career still resonates decades after he played his last game, is not simply because he was talented. Many quarterbacks have been talented. It is because his career told a story. And that story, the story of a man who was given every gift except the one he wanted most, and who spent 16 years fighting to claim it, is one that touches something universal in the human experience. It is the story of anyone who has ever wanted something badly enough to endure years of failure in pursuit of it. Anyone who has ever been told they are not good enough and refused to accept that verdict. Anyone who has ever wondered, in the quiet moments between the public performances, whether the thing they are chasing will ever be caught. John Elway caught it, and the catching of it, the moment when he finally held that trophy above his head, with tears running down his face, and the ghosts of 3 Super Bowl losses standing at his back, is one of the most purely satisfying moments in the history of sports. But there is one more dimension to these defining moments that bears examination, and it concerns the nature of time itself. Each of the 5 moments described above gains its power not only from what happened, but from when it happened in the larger arc of Elway's career. The drive would have been merely impressive if Elway had gone on to win the Super Bowl that year. It became legendary because it was followed by the first devastating loss, which cast the moment in a different light, revealing it as the beginning of a longer and more painful journey, rather than a triumphant conclusion. The death of Jack Elway would have been privately devastating regardless of when it occurred, but its impact on the public narrative was amplified by its timing, coming after the 3rd Super Bowl loss and before the eventual redemption. The helicopter play derives its almost mythological status not merely from the physical act itself, but from its placement in the timeline. Had Elway spun through the air at the age of 25, it would have been a highlight. At 37, in the biggest game of his life, with 15 years of accumulated failure behind him, it became something more. It became a symbol, a declaration that the old man was not finished, that the story was not over, that the years of losing had not broken the part of him that refused to stay on the ground. Every defining moment in Elway's career was made more powerful by every moment that preceded it. The narrative was cumulative. Each chapter drew its meaning from the chapters that came before, and the final chapters, the ones where the hero finally prevails, would have been hollow without the weight of all that earlier disappointment pressing against them. Behind every legend there is a man, and behind John Elway the legend, there was a man whose life was both more complicated and more revealing than the highlight reels ever showed. The public image of Elway was polished and seemingly effortless. Tall, handsome, athletic, charismatic, the gap-toothed smile, the easy confidence in front of the cameras, the endorsement deals and the public appearances, and the air of success that surrounded him like a well-tailored suit. He was, to all appearances, the model of the American sports hero, blessed with talent, rewarded with championships, beloved by an entire city. But the private reality was more complicated. It always is. The same qualities that made Elway great on the football field, the perfectionism, the intensity, the relentless drive to win, created pressures in his personal life that were not always visible to the outside world. His first marriage to Janet Buchan, whom he had met during his time at Stanford University, lasted nearly 2 decades before ending in divorce in 2003. The couple had 4 children together. They had been through everything together: the early years of struggle, the Super Bowl losses, the Super Bowl victories, the retirement, the transition to life after football. And then, in the quiet aftermath of all those shared experiences, the marriage ended. Let that sink in. A marriage that survived 3 Super Bowl losses. A marriage that survived the intense pressure of being the most famous couple in Denver for 16 years. A marriage that survived the emotional toll of Jack Elway's death and all the grief that followed. That marriage did not survive the transition to ordinary life. There is a painful irony in this. The extraordinary circumstances, the football, the fame, the pressure, held the relationship together by giving it a common purpose and a shared identity. When those circumstances disappeared, when the football was over and the cheering stopped, and the couple was left with nothing but each other, something essential had been lost. Or perhaps something essential had never been there, hidden behind the noise and the spectacle and the relentless forward momentum of a professional football career. This is not a judgment. It is an observation about the cost of the kind of life that John Elway lived. Professional athletes at the highest level give everything to their sport, their time, their energy, their focus, their emotional bandwidth. There is only so much of a person to go around, and when the sport takes the lion's share, the people who are waiting at home, the wife, the children, the friends, receive whatever is left over. Sometimes what is left over is enough. Sometimes it is not. Elway has not spoken publicly in detail about the reasons for his divorce, and it would be inappropriate to speculate beyond what is known. But the pattern, a long marriage that dissolves after the end of a demanding career, is common enough among retired athletes to suggest that it reflects something systemic rather than personal. The sport takes more than the body, it takes the whole person. And when it is finished taking, there may not be enough left to sustain the relationships that were put on hold. Let that sink in. The greatest quarterback of his generation, a man who achieved everything the sport has to offer, who won championships and accolades, and the adoration of millions, could not sustain his most important personal relationship through the transition to life after football. This is not a failure in the traditional sense. It is a consequence, a cost, one of the hidden invoices that the game sends to the people who play it at the highest level, payable not during the career but after it, when the crowds have gone home and the stadium lights have been turned off and the silence of ordinary life closes in. Elway's relationship with his own identity is another dimension of this deeper truth. For his entire adult life, from the age of 18 when he arrived at Stanford to the age of 38 when he retired from the Broncos, John Elway was defined by football. He was a football player. That was his identity, his purpose, his reason for being. Every day was structured around the demands of the sport. Every relationship was filtered through the lens of the sport. Every decision, from where to live to how to spend his time, was dictated by the sport. Football was not something he did, it was something he was. And then, abruptly, it was over. Retirement for a professional athlete is not like retirement for a person with a conventional career. It does not happen at 65 after decades of gradually winding down. It happens at 35 or 38, in the prime of life, and it is absolute. One day, you are the starting quarterback of a professional football team, with a locker and a playbook and a schedule that accounts for every hour of every day. The next day, you are a civilian. No locker, no playbook, no schedule, no purpose that can match the intensity and the meaning of what you left behind. The morning routine disappears first. For 2 decades, Elway had awakened each day with a clearly defined mission. During the season, there were practices and film sessions and meetings, and the relentless preparation that goes into game planning for the following Sunday's opponent. During the off-season, there were workouts and conditioning sessions, and the quiet, steady labor of keeping a 30-something body capable of performing at the highest level of professional athletics. Every hour had a purpose, every day had a rhythm. The structure of professional football is all-encompassing, and for the player who lives within it, the structure becomes invisible, as natural and unremarkable as the air he breathes. It is only when the structure is removed, when the schedule empties, and the phone stops ringing, and the days stretch out into shapeless expanses of unallocated time, that the player realizes how much of his identity was embedded in that structure. How much of who he was depended not on what he chose to do, but on what the sport required him to do. Elway has spoken in interviews about the difficulty of this adjustment, though always with the understated stoicism that was his public manner. He did not dramatize his struggles. He did not seek sympathy. He acknowledged that the transition was hard. That there were days when he did not know what to do with himself, when the silence of his post-football life felt oppressive in ways he had not anticipated. But he framed these struggles as challenges to be overcome, not burdens to be pitied. This was consistent with his character. John Elway had spent his entire career refusing to be defined by his setbacks. He was not about to start now. Many retired athletes struggle with this transition. Some turn to business. Some turn to broadcasting. Some turn to coaching. Some turn to less constructive pursuits, seeking to fill the void left by the sport with substances or behaviors that provide a temporary simulation of the adrenaline and purpose that competition once supplied. Elway's transition was more successful than many, but it was not without its difficulties. He invested in automobile dealerships and other business ventures, with mixed results. He tried his hand at the restaurant business. He explored various entrepreneurial opportunities. Some succeeded, others did not. The results were inconsistent in a way that his football career had not been, and the inconsistency itself was a kind of lesson. The skills that make a great quarterback, the arm strength, the competitive fire, the ability to read a defense and make a split-second decision, do not automatically translate to the boardroom. Business requires a different kind of intelligence, a different kind of patience, a different kind of risk management. Elway was learning a new game, and the learning curve was steep. His return to the Denver Broncos in 2011 as Executive Vice President of Football Operations was, in many ways, an attempt to recapture the sense of purpose that football had provided. In this role, Elway was responsible for the team's roster construction, player personnel decisions, and overall football strategy. It was a position that leveraged his football knowledge and his reputation while keeping him connected to the sport that had defined his life. His first major move was a masterpiece. He recruited Peyton Manning, the legendary Indianapolis Colts quarterback who had been released due to a neck injury, to come to Denver as a free agent. Manning, like Elway, was a future Hall of Famer. He brought credibility, talent, and a work ethic that lifted the entire organization. With Manning at quarterback, the Broncos returned to championship contention almost immediately, reaching the Super Bowl after the 2013 season and winning it all after the 2015 season, defeating the Carolina Panthers in Super Bowl 50. Elway's success in recruiting Manning and building a championship-caliber roster earned him widespread praise. But the years that followed Manning's retirement in 2016 were more difficult. The Broncos struggled to find a replacement quarterback, cycling through a series of starters, including Trevor Siemian, Brock Osweiler, Paxton Lynch, Case Keenum, Joe Flacco, and others. None could replicate Manning's success. The team's record declined. The fans grew restless. And Elway, who had been universally beloved as a player, began to face criticism as an executive. His draft choices were questioned. His free agent signings were scrutinized. The same media that had celebrated his playing career now second-guessed his front office decisions with the same intensity they had once applied to his Super Bowl losses. There is a lesson in this too. The transition from player to executive is one of the most treacherous journeys in professional sports. The skills are different, the timeline is different, the criteria for success are different. A great player sees the game from the field, in the moment, through the lens of his own physical abilities. A great executive sees the game from above, over years, through the lens of roster construction and salary cap management and long-term strategic planning. These are fundamentally different perspectives, and the ability to hold one does not guarantee the ability to hold the other. Elway was a good executive, not a great one. He made some brilliant moves and some costly mistakes. He was in the front office what he had been on the field in his early years. Talented but inconsistent. Capable of brilliance but also prone to errors. The difference was that there was no fourth-quarter comeback in the front office. Mistakes in personnel decisions do not resolve themselves in a single dramatic drive. They compound over years and draft cycles and contract negotiations, and by the time their full impact is felt, it is often too late to reverse them. There is a loneliness that attaches itself to a figure like John Elway. He is recognized everywhere he goes in Denver. He cannot walk into a restaurant or a grocery store without being approached by strangers who want to shake his hand, take a photograph, or simply tell him what his career meant to them. This is flattering, of course. It is also isolating. Fame of this magnitude creates a barrier between the famous person and the rest of the world, a transparent wall that allows others to see in but prevents the famous person from reaching out. Elway is surrounded by admirers, but potentially lonely in a way that most people cannot understand. The adulation is for the legend, not the man. For number 7, not for John. And the gap between the legend and the man, between what the public sees and what the person feels, can be wider than anyone on the outside would imagine. Elway did find personal happiness again. In 2009, he married Paige Green, a former Oakland Raiders cheerleader whom he had been dating for several years. The relationship represented a fresh start, an opportunity to build something new outside the long shadow of his first marriage and outside the gravitational pull of his football identity. By all accounts, the marriage was a healthy one, grounded in mutual respect and a shared desire to build a life that was not entirely defined by the past. Elway seemed lighter in photographs from this period, more relaxed, more comfortable in his own skin. The weight of expectation that had pressed down on him since he was 18 years old had finally begun to lift, replaced by something quieter and more sustainable. Not the roar of the stadium, something gentler than that, something that did not demand perfection. But the deeper truth of John Elway's post-football life is not about the relationships or the business ventures or even the return to the Broncos front office. It is about the fundamental question that every person of extraordinary achievement must eventually confront. Who are you when you are no longer doing the thing that made you extraordinary? Strip away the uniform and the helmet and the playbook. Strip away the cheering crowds and the television cameras and the million-dollar contracts. Strip away the trophies and the records and the Hall of Fame bust. What remains? This is not a question that most people have to answer in such stark terms. Most people's identities are distributed across multiple roles and relationships and activities. They are a parent and a spouse and a friend and a worker and a member of a community. And no single role consumes so much of the self that its loss creates an existential vacuum. But for someone like Elway, whose identity was so thoroughly and so publicly fused with a single activity, the question is not abstract. It is immediate and personal and potentially devastating. The automobile dealerships were more than a financial investment. They were a lifeline. They gave Elway something to do, somewhere to go, a structure around which to organize his days. The John Elway dealerships became a significant business enterprise in the Denver area, selling tens of thousands of vehicles over the years. Elway threw himself into the business with the same competitive energy he had brought to football. He learned the details of the automotive industry, the financing, and the inventory management and the customer relations. He visited his dealerships regularly, walking the showroom floors, talking to salespeople, reviewing the numbers. It was not football. Nothing would ever be football. But it was something, and something was better than the alternative, which was sitting in an empty house with a trophy case full of memories and no idea what to do with the rest of his life. His involvement in the restaurant industry told a similar story. Elway's, the steakhouse he opened in the Cherry Creek neighborhood of Denver, became one of the city's premier dining establishments. The restaurant traded on his name and his celebrity, of course. People came because they wanted to eat at John Elway's restaurant, to sit in the space that bore his name, to perhaps catch a glimpse of the man himself. But the restaurant also had to succeed on its own merits, and Elway made sure it did. The food was excellent. The service was attentive. The atmosphere was sophisticated without being pretentious. It was in many ways a reflection of how Elway wanted to be perceived in his post-football life. Successful, classy, relevant, still a winner, even if the arena had changed. But there were failures too, and the failures revealed something important about the nature of athletic fame and its limitations. Not every business venture succeeded. Not every investment paid off. And when things went wrong in the business world, there was no fourth quarter to fall back on. No 2-minute drill that could transform a loss into a victory through sheer force of will. The business world operated by different rules that did not care about arm strength or competitive desire, or the ability to inspire 11 men to play beyond their abilities on a cold January afternoon. The business world cared about margins and market timing and consumer sentiment, and 100 other variables that could not be controlled by any individual, no matter how talented or determined. The experience of watching the Broncos decline after Manning's retirement carried its own particular anguish. Elway had experienced losing as a player, of course. He had experienced it in the most public and painful way imaginable, on the Super Bowl stage, in front of the entire country. But losing as an executive was different. As a player, he could always grab the ball and try to win the game himself. As an executive, he was dependent on the players he selected, and the coaches he hired, and the decisions he made in draft rooms and meeting rooms that were invisible to the public. When those decisions proved wrong, when the quarterback he drafted did not develop, or the free agent he signed did not perform, there was no way to personally compensate for the mistake. He could not put on a helmet and fix it himself. He could only watch from the owner's box as the consequences of his decisions played out on the field below, knowing that the criticism was coming, and that, in many cases, the criticism was deserved. His departure from the Broncos organization in 2020, after the Walton Penner ownership group completed its purchase of the franchise, marked the end of an era that had begun when he first arrived in Denver as a 23-year-old rookie in 1983. For nearly 4 decades, in one capacity or another, John Elway had been synonymous with the Denver Broncos. His absence left a void that was felt not just in the organization's front office, but in the identity of the franchise itself. The Broncos without Elway were still the Broncos, of course. The same orange and blue, the same stadium, the same fans, but something intangible was missing, some connection to the history and the tradition, and the emotional core of what it meant to be a Denver Bronco. Elway had been that connection, the living bridge between the franchise's past and its present, and without him, the bridge was gone. This is the deeper truth of John Elway's story. It is not just about football. It is about the human struggle to find meaning and purpose and identity in a world that is constantly changing. Elway found his first purpose on the football field, and it sustained him for 20 years. He found his second purpose in the front office, and it sustained him for another decade. Now, in the quiet years beyond both of those chapters, he faces the same challenge that awaits everyone who has ever poured themselves into something larger than themselves. The challenge of what comes next. The challenge of who you are when the crowd has gone home and the lights have been turned off, and the only person left in the room is you. When we talk about the legacy of John Elway, we are talking about more than a quarterback. We are talking about what it means to define a position, to define a franchise, and to define an era of American sports. Elway's career bridged 2 distinct periods in NFL history. He entered the league in 1983, during the early years of the modern passing era, when quarterbacks were just beginning to be recognized as the most important players on the field. He left the league in 1999, on the cusp of the 21st century, having helped establish the template for what a franchise quarterback could be and what a franchise quarterback should aspire to become. Before Elway, the idea of a quarterback who could do everything was mostly theoretical. There had been mobile quarterbacks, there had been strong-armed quarterbacks, there had been intelligent quarterbacks who read defenses like professors reading textbooks, but the combination of all 3 qualities, in a single player operating at the highest level of professional competition for a sustained period of time, was unprecedented. Elway proved that a quarterback did not have to choose between being a passer and being an athlete. He could be both. He could throw the ball 60 yards and run for a first down on the next play. He could read a defense like a scholar and improvise like a street musician. He could carry a team on his back for an entire season and then deliver the decisive blow in the biggest moment of the biggest game. This template, this vision of the complete quarterback, became the standard against which every subsequent quarterback prospect was measured. When NFL scouts evaluate young quarterbacks today, they are looking for echoes of Elway. They are searching for the arm strength that can make every throw on the field, the mobility that can extend plays and create opportunities outside the structure of the designed play, the intelligence that can process complex defensive schemes and make the right decision under pressure, the leadership that can inspire teammates and elevate the performance of everyone around them, and the competitiveness, that fierce, almost primal refusal to lose that separates the good from the great and the great from the legendary. Patrick Mahomes of the Kansas City Chiefs, widely regarded as the best quarterback of the current generation, plays a style that owes a significant debt to Elway: the off-platform throws, the willingness to improvise, the ability to make plays that no other quarterback can make. Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills, with his combination of arm strength and running ability, is another descendant of the Elway prototype. Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens, who has redefined what a running quarterback can accomplish, carries a piece of Elway's legacy in his game. These players may not cite Elway as a direct influence. They may have grown up watching different quarterbacks, admiring different styles, but the position they play, the expectations that are placed upon them, and the standard against which they are judged all trace back, in part, to the man who wore number 7 for the Denver Broncos. But Elway's legacy extends beyond the evolution of the quarterback position. He is also a symbol of perseverance, perhaps the most powerful symbol of perseverance in the history of professional football. 3 Super Bowl losses, 3 blowouts, 3 occasions when the brightest spotlight in American sports revealed, in painful detail, the gap between individual talent and collective achievement. A lesser competitor would have been broken by those losses. A lesser man would have accepted the narrative that he was not built for the biggest stage. A lesser spirit would have faded into the comfortable retirement of the merely very good, the quarterback who made the Hall of Fame but never won the big one. Elway refused that fate. He kept playing. He kept competing. He kept believing, even when the evidence against belief was overwhelming. And when the moment finally came, when the roster improved and the coaching aligned and the running game materialized and all the pieces that had been missing for 15 years finally fell into place, Elway was ready. He was 37 years old. His arm was not as strong as it had once been. His legs were slower. His body ached in ways it had not ached a decade earlier. But his will was unbroken. His desire was undiminished. And when the opportunity presented itself, he seized it with the same intensity that had defined his career from the very beginning. This quality, this refusal to accept defeat as a permanent condition, resonates far beyond the football field. It is a quality that touches something universal in the human experience. Everyone who has ever worked toward a goal that seemed unattainable, everyone who has been told that their dream is impossible, everyone who has fallen short and picked themselves up and tried again, can see something of themselves in John Elway's story. His journey from the despair of 3 Super Bowl losses to the ecstasy of 2 Super Bowl victories is not just a football story. It is a human story, a story about the resilience of the human spirit and the power of persistence in the face of repeated failure. The city of Denver has never forgotten what Elway gave them. He gave them 16 years of his life, his body, and his talent. He gave them the drive, which remains one of the most celebrated sequences in NFL history. He gave them 2 Lombardi trophies, which transformed Denver from a football city into a championship city. And he gave them pride. The pride of knowing that their quarterback was the toughest, most determined, most talented player on the field every Sunday. The pride of knowing that when the game was on the line, number 7 would find a way. Elway's induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, in 2004 was a formality. There was never any doubt that he belonged among the greatest players in the history of the sport. His bust sits in the hall alongside the men who came before him and the men who followed, a permanent record of what he achieved and what he meant to the game. But the true measure of Elway's legacy is not in Canton, it is in Denver. It is in the generation of fans who grew up watching him play, who learned what competitiveness and determination looked like by watching number 7 refuse to accept defeat. It is in the stadiums and the living rooms and the parking lot tailgates where his name is still spoken with a reverence that time has not diminished and probably never will. Consider the numbers for a moment, the final accounting of a career that spanned 16 seasons and 234 regular season starts. Elway threw for more than 51,000 yards. He threw 300 touchdowns against 226 interceptions. He rushed for more than 3,000 yards and 33 touchdowns, Numbers that do not capture the full scope of his running ability, because they do not account for the countless occasions when he escaped the pocket and threw on the move rather than running for yardage. He won 148 regular season games, a total that placed him among the winningest quarterbacks in NFL history at the time of his retirement. He led 47 fourth-quarter or overtime game-winning drives, a record that stood for years, and that speaks more eloquently than any other number about the kind of player he was. When the game was on the line, when the pressure was at its most intense, when the margin for error was thinnest, Elway was at his best. This is the rarest and most valuable quality a quarterback can possess, and Elway possessed it in greater measure than almost anyone who has ever played the position. His impact on the Denver Broncos as a franchise cannot be overstated. When Elway arrived in 1983, the Broncos were a respectable but unremarkable franchise. They had one previous Super Bowl appearance, a loss to the Dallas Cowboys in Super Bowl 12. They played in a market that was small by NFL standards, a western city that lacked the historical cachet of a New York or a Chicago or a Pittsburgh. They did not have a tradition of championship football. They did not have a national following. They were, in the hierarchy of NFL franchises, somewhere in the middle. Good but not great. Competitive but not dominant. Present but not essential. Elway changed all of that. He transformed the Broncos from a regional franchise into a national brand. He gave Denver a relevance in the NFL conversation that it had never previously enjoyed. During his 16 seasons, the Broncos appeared in 5 Super Bowls, won 2 of them, won more regular season games than almost any other team in the league, and established themselves as one of the premier franchises in professional football. The stadium was full every Sunday. The merchandise sold across the country. The waiting list for season tickets grew longer with each passing year. All of this happened because of one man, one player who elevated an entire organization through the force of his talent and his personality and his refusal to accept mediocrity as a standard. The era that Elway represented, the era of the quarterback who carried his team through sheer individual brilliance, may be gradually fading. Modern football is increasingly collaborative, increasingly dependent on schemes and systems and analytics and the collective execution of 11 players working in concert. The idea that one man can pick up an entire franchise and carry it to a championship through the force of his own talent and will is becoming less tenable with each passing season. But the memory of what Elway did, the way he played, the way he competed, the way he refused to settle for anything less than everything, endures. It endures because it speaks to something that statistics and analytics and modern coaching philosophy cannot quantify. It speaks to the heart. And the heart, in the end, is what separates the champions from the rest. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It is January of 1998. A warm California night in San Diego. The confetti is falling from the rafters of Qualcomm Stadium. The Denver Broncos have just defeated the Green Bay Packers in Super Bowl 32. The field is a chaos of orange and blue, of cameras and reporters, of teammates embracing and strangers weeping, and the organized pandemonium that accompanies the final moments of the biggest game in American sports. And there, in the middle of it all, is John Elway. He is holding the Lombardi Trophy. His eyes are wet with tears. His smile is wide and genuine and carries the weight of 15 years of waiting, 15 years of falling short, 15 years of getting back up. He is not the young man who arrived in Denver in 1983, full of talent and confidence and the untested belief that he could conquer the football world. He is older now. His hair has thinned. His face shows the lines that come from years of squinting into the sun and grimacing through pain. His body aches in places that will never fully heal. He has been knocked down hundreds of times on football fields across America. He has been sacked. He has been hit after releasing the ball. He has been blindsided by defenders he never saw coming. He has been piled on at the bottom of scrums, feeling the weight of 300-pound linemen compressing his ribs and his spine. He has thrown interceptions at the worst possible moments and stood on the sideline watching opposing teams celebrate victories that should have been his. But he is standing here now, holding the trophy, and all of that is behind him. Every doubt has been answered. every critic has been silenced, every failure has been redeemed, not erased. Never erased. The losses are still there, the pain is still there, the memory of those 3 Super Bowl blowouts still lives in some corner of his consciousness, a scar that will never fully fade. But the losses have been answered. And in being answered, they have been transformed. They are no longer the story of a man who could not win. They are the first act of a story about a man who would not stop trying until he did. John Elway's story is a football story. It is about touchdowns and interceptions, about playoff victories and Super Bowl defeats, about the mechanics of throwing a spiral and the strategy of reading a zone defense. It is about audibles and blitzes and play-action fakes and the precise angle of a quarterback's back foot as he drops into the pocket. It is about the 10,000 small, technical details that separate a professional quarterback from everyone else who has ever thrown a football. These details matter. They are the foundation upon which the legend was built. But Elway's story is also a human story, and the human elements are what give it its power. It is about a boy who learned to throw a football from his father, about a young man who was told he was the greatest prospect anyone had ever seen, and who then had to spend 16 years trying to live up to that impossible expectation. About a man who failed on the biggest stage, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and who found within himself the courage and the stubbornness to come back a 4th time and finally succeed. And it is about the passage of time, about how the years accumulate, and the body breaks down, and the window of opportunity grows smaller and smaller, until it seems like it is about to close forever, and about what happens when a man reaches through that closing window and grabs hold of his dream at the very last possible moment. There will never be another John Elway. The NFL will continue to produce great quarterbacks. It will continue to produce great athletes and great competitors and great stories. But there will never be another player who combined that specific mixture of physical talent, competitive fire, and dramatic narrative in quite the way Elway did. He was the right man, in the right city, at the right time, facing the right obstacles. His story is too perfect to be fiction and too painful to be a fairy tale. It is something in between. Something that could only happen in real life, where the script is unwritten and the outcome is uncertain, and the hero does not always win, except when he does. And when he does, the winning means everything because the losing came first. In Denver, there is a bronze statue of Elway outside the stadium where the Broncos play their home games. The statue captures him in the act of throwing, his arm cocked back, his body coiled, his eyes focused on a target that only he can see. On game days, fans walk past that statue on their way into the stadium. Some stop to take photographs, some reach out and touch the bronze, a wordless gesture of respect and gratitude. Most just glance at it and keep walking, because they do not need to stop. They already know the story. They carry it with them. It is woven into the fabric of their city, their team, their shared identity as Broncos fans, as people from Denver, as people who understand what it means to wait a long time for something beautiful, and to finally, against all odds, receive it. John Elway drove Denver to glory. He did it the hard way, through years of heartbreak and doubt and public failure that would have crushed a lesser spirit. He did it with an arm that could change the trajectory of a game in a single throw, and a will that could not be bent or broken by any force the football world could bring against it. He did it for his teammates, who blocked and tackled and caught and ran alongside him for 16 seasons. He did it for his city, which gave him its heart and asked only that he give his in return. He did it for the memory of his father, who put the first football in his hands and taught him that the only acceptable standard was your absolute best. And he did it for himself, for the part of him that refused, always and completely, to accept that losing was his destiny. The lights in the stadium are dark now. The crowds have gone home. The echoes of those Sunday afternoons, the cheers and the heartbreaks and the moments of impossible beauty have faded into the long, quiet distance of memory. But the story remains. It remains because it is true, and because true stories, the ones that carry the full weight of human struggle and human triumph, never really end. They settle into the silence and they wait. They wait for someone to tell them again. They wait for a new generation to hear them and feel them and understand that the game they watch today was shaped by the men who played it yesterday. And this one, the story of number 7, the story of the gap-toothed kid from Port Angeles who grew up on practice fields and became the most exciting quarterback of his generation, who lost 3 Super Bowls and won 2 more, who spun through the air like a helicopter at the age of 37 because he refused to be tackled 1 yard short of a first down, who wept when he finally held the trophy, and wept again when he said goodbye. This story is one worth telling again and again and again, because it reminds us that the drive is never really over, that as long as there is time on the clock and air in your lungs and a single yard of grass between you and the end zone, there is still a chance. John Elway proved that. He proved it 98 yards at a time, and then he proved it one more time, on the biggest stage of all, when the whole world was watching, and the whole world was doubting, and the whole world was wrong.